This episode of the podcast is sponsored by Aleph Beta. How can we make Tisha B'Av feel relevant and meaningful for us today when the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash was so long ago? These questions may be impossible to answer, but on Tisha B'Av they are just as impossible to ignore. With Tisha B'Av approaching, I want to encourage you to check out Aleph Beta's collection of Tisha B'Av videos. Rabbi David Foreman, founder of Aleph Beta, who is a guest on the Seforim Chatter podcast, explores some of the most beloved Tisha B'Av texts to discover the deeper meaning and relevance of the day. For a limited time, listeners of the Seforim Chatter podcast get $18 off an annual Aleph Beta membership, which will give you access to all the Tisha B'Av videos, plus hundreds more on Parsha and other Yomim Tovim U'Me'adim. All you need to do is go to alephbeta.org, that's ALEPHBETA.org, and enter coupon code SEFORIM23, SEFORIM 23, when you check out for $18 off an annual premium membership. And this information will be in the show's notes. And you can find the previous episode with Rabbi Foreman on Seforim Chatter, and I've talked about them in the past. They're very interesting. They have like these cartoon videos going through Divrei Torah, so it's an interesting kind of unique approach. You can check that out. This episode of the podcast is not 3 weeks themed, even loosely. So what's the connection? The connection is it's a biography about the life and works of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, his very, very famous, magnum opus. And so this is because his yard site is Chav Ches Tammuz, which is Monday. So I figured it's appropriate that the podcast should be released, the episode should be released here. Also, stay tuned for the end. There was a little addendum. This episode was recorded a number of months ago. After that, so we talked about his Seforim, mainly the Pnei Shlomo, his Chedushim on Shas, was reissued in a 3-volume instead of a 5-volume Mechon Yerushalayim, and Apriyon, his Sefer on Chumash, was redone in a beautiful new edition. So we recorded a short clip at the end, about an extra 14 minutes, I think, discussing these additional Seforim and some other notes that came up after the podcast. So that will be at the end. So you'll hear us talking about Apriyon and Pnei Shlomo and some other stuff. There'll be more discussion about that at the end of the episode. Also, as always, I like to mention, if anyone wants to sponsor an episode, you can, in the show's notes, there's a link via PayPal. You can also, there's Zelle, Chase QuickPay, seforimchatter@gmail.com. Also, any amount, even a lower amount, the sponsorship is $360, but you can do a lesser amount. Very much appreciated. As well as if you can subscribe on Apple Podcast, Google, 24/6, wherever you listen to, and rate is on Apple and Google. 24/6 is no rating, but wherever you listen, or if it's anywhere else, again, if you can subscribe, very much appreciated, and enjoy the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Seforim Chatter podcast. And this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined by Rabbi Yitzchak Stroh, who is the editor and of the Sefer Yad Shlomo that will be taught, and wrote some of the stuff in there, and he also wrote edits other Seforim and articles. And we'll be discussing Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, which is the author of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, Kesses HaSofer, and other Seforim. Which is what this, with the Yad Shlomo, we'll talk about what it's about. It's a biography and collection of articles about Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, with a small sefer of his, and bibliography, and a lot of things all about Rav Shlomo Ganzfried in his life. So thank you, Yitzchak, for joining me.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start off. Tell the listeners a little bit about yourself and your background.
Okay, I'm a Borough Park boy. I grew up in Borough Park in the 70s, when it wasn't Chassidish the way it is now. I learned in Stolen Yeshiva, a little bit in Tervadas. From there I went to Litvish Yeshivas. I was in South Fallsburg, Passaic. And as a teenager, I gravitated towards Lubavitch. I learned in Lubavitch Yeshiva for a couple of years. After my chasana, I moved to Monsey. I spent a couple of years in Koilel. And since then, I've been learning privately with Bochrim. I have a strong interest since I was young in history and Seforim and all Judaica type of issues.
So how'd you get into Rav Shlomo Ganzfried specifically? You wrote some other things, maybe we'll talk about later, your other work, other Seforim, but Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, we're talking about in this episode of the podcast. I mean, what was the specific shaykhs to him?
I'm actually an Einikel of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. My great-grandfather moved to Borough Park they came from Romania about a little over 100 years ago, in 1920, 21. And in 1923, they moved to Borough Park. That's my mother's grandfather. And he was a plain grandson of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. And I have still my aunt and some of the cousins that still remember him, and he remembered Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. So there's a family connection, and since I was a kid, it was always fascinated me, and I was very interested in Rav Shlomo Ganzfried and the Kitzur and other Seforim, and anything about him was of interest.
So did you learn Kitzur Shulchan Aruch growing up?
In yeshiva, like anyone else, today I have a say in Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, but I can't say it's like a particular sefer that I've learned more than any other sefer.
Right. Okay. And we'll get later, but you compiled this bibliography. I mean, not until today, because it'd be like endless, but how popular Kitzur Shulchan Aruch was and remains. Okay. So let's talk about Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. Listeners are probably familiar with him. They're familiar with the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, with Kesses HaSofer, but let's talk about him. When was he born? Where was he born? Where is he from?
Okay, Rav Shlomo Ganzfried was born in Ungvar. Today it's in Ukraine, in Western Ukraine. Today it's called Uzhgorod. It's right near Hungary and Slovakia. He was born, according to my estimate, in 1808, even though they generally give the date as 1804, but I think 1808 is correct. His father and his grandfather were both from Ungvar, and his mother's father was a dayan in Ungvar. His mother's father's name was Rav Shlomo. We don't know a last name, and that's who Rav Shlomo Ganzfried is named after. And his grandfather's father-in-law, his name was Rabbi Aaron Beidik Reisman. He was the first Rav, the first Ashkenazic Rav in Ungvar, and he set up the Kehillah in Ungvar. So that's where Rabbi Shlomo was born, and he spent his early years. He lost his father when he was quite young, probably just a child, I would say, of maybe even 4 or 5 years, when his father passed away. And at that time, the Rav in Ungvar was Reb Tzvi Hirsch Heller, known as Reb Hershel Charif. He had come to Ungvar because he ran away, I think he was in Brody, and he ran away from there. He came to Ungvar. After the Rav in Ungvar was nifta, he took over. He became the Rav in Ungvar, and he was the Rav in Ungvar for a number of years. After Shlomo's father was nifta, Reb Hersh Charev, Reb Tzvi Hirsch Heller, became his apotropos. He became his guardian, and he took care of him. And so, like I say, he was born in 1808. According to the way I understand it, so he must have been a child of about 11 in 1819, when Reb Hersh Heller got a job. He was appointed as the Rav in Bonihad, in Bonihad, and he took along Reb Hersh Heller. Reb Tzvi Hirsch Heller took along Reb Shlomo Ganzfried as a child to Bonihad, where he learned in the yeshiva by him for a number of years until his marriage, until he came back to Ungvar, and he got married in Ungvar. I would say that would be around 1826.
So when his father was nifta, and then when he went with, you said it was Hirsch Charif left, Hirsch Heller left, and Shlomo went with him. Was that you said it was 11 or he was younger? Was that a normal thing, like a children always went? He went to learn in yeshiva. He went out of town, so to speak.
So it's interesting. His grandson, in his biography, mentions that he took along, in order that he shouldn't be alone, he took along a friend for him. That was Reb Tzvi Hirsch Friedman, who became known later as the Chassidish Rebbe Reb Hershel Liska. And Reb Hershel Liska was also a Yassim. He also lost his father at a young age. He lived in Il. His apotropos was the Yismach Moshe. And traveling, that's the way I assume probably what happened, traveling from Ungvar, from Uzhgorod, which is further north to the east. And when he was traveling to Bonihad, he passed by Il. It's on the way. And in Il, Reb Hershel Lisko, the child, in other words, his name was Hirsch Friedman. He was also about the same age, and he took him along as a companion for Reb Shlomo Ganzfried. And they became very, very close friends, and they stayed close friends all the years until, like we'll see, they stayed to be, very close friends. And that's also, at that time, Reb Shlomo Ganzfried, I'm sure, had a chance to see the Yismach Moshe. probably saw him on other occasions too.
So we'll get more to that later. His Rav Shlomo Ganzfried and his shaykhs and his relationship with chassidus. That's discussed in the Sefer. So we'll talk more about it. So you mentioned so this Tzvi Hirsch, he was Charav Heller. That was his Rebbe Muvak. Was there any other rebbeim?
That was his Rebbe Muvak. He always calls him Rebbe. He also refers to one of the other rabbanim in Ungvar, Ramotcha Madrish Weinreb. He refers to him as Meiri. He also refers to Remeir Ash as Meiri, the Rav in Ungvar. I'm not sure if he actually learned by them, or if it was just because they were the rabbanim, and he was probably, when he came back to Ungvar as a younger man, he was under their influence, so he refers to them as his Rebbe. But that's not clear if he actually studied them, if he actually learned by them.
Okay, so let's not fast forward. We're up to there before you mentioned that he got married. I think it was 1820. Was that 1826 or?
I would say he got married. He left yeshiva. Apparently, they came back together. The two friends came back together. From Ushgarad, I'm assuming Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Friedman, the Rabbi Shaliska, moved back to I think after his marriage, he might have lived in Eel. And Rav Shlomo Ganzfried got married and moved back to Ungvar. His wife was from Humano or that area, and he sat and learned for a while as a learning person in Ungvar.
Rav Shlomo Ganzfried.
Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, yeah. He's for a while he must have learned, and then his father-in-law probably supported him. His father-in-law was a wealthy wine merchant, and then at the time that he gave whatever he owed to Shlomo Ganzfried. He gave it to him, and he gave it to him actually in wine or in liquor, and there was a whole deal that he lent. He got money from someone for the liquor, and then there was a whole question of a shaila of ribbis, which they ended up asking the Kesses HaSofer about. And that must have been when he first went into business. And for a while, he must have been in business. Apparently, he was not successful in business. Around it seems probably in the 1830s, he might have been working as a dayan in Ungvar, because that's what the Kesses HaSofer calls him, a dayan in Ungvar. But he writes that even at the time that he was working, he would spend his nights learning constantly. He would spend his time, sitting and learning. Then about 1840, he accepted a rabbanus in Brezovitz, and he stayed there for a number of years. And then later he returned to Ungvar, where he remained as a dayan until his passing in 1886.
Okay, so a couple of things to get to. You mentioned earlier that Ungvar had, you mentioned like the Ashkenazi Rav. What type of kehila exactly was it? What type of, was it Hasidish? Was it Ashkenazi? What was going on over there?
Okay, so apparently it was a Ashkenazi kehila. There was one, this might be a little bit later, but in 1878, there's a tshuva to Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, written to Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. Rav Shlomo Ganzfried asked a shaila by the author of the Sharei Deya. His name was Reb Chaim Yehuda Leib from Sosnitzer. He was actually a Chabad chassid, and the question was, I think it was a Rav and Brody, and he posed a question that there were 3 dayanim in Ungvar, and one of the dayanim passed away, and they were looking for a third dayan, and the third dayan was a chassid, and the 2 dayanim, their nusach hatfilah was nusach Ashkenaz, and the third was nusach Sfard, or rather the nusach of the chasidim. And the question was, if it was a question of leisis skoidedu, well, you're going to have 2 dayanim, let's say you'll have 2 dayanim wearing tefillin chalamoid and one not, so if it would be an issue. And Shlomo Ganzfried wrote that he has a Kabbalah from Remeir Ash, the previous Rav of Ungvar, that such a thing should not be done. But in okay, he doesn't write that he's referring to Ungvar, but historical circumstances seem to show, because at that time a dayan was nifta, and that's probably what he is referring to. And he writes that the city is everybody's davening Nusach Ashkenaz, and there's one klois which davens Nusach Sfard, which he means the chasidim. So it was basically Ashkenazish city with a little bit of Chassidish influence.
Now he himself, you mentioned earlier his shaykhis to his friend who became a Chassidish rebbe. So what was his shaykhis to Chassidim? He himself, daven Ashkenaz, he was Latin.
Yes, we see from the story, because he was one of the two dayanim, so he was probably davening Ashkenaz, and we know that he was Ashkenazish. That's where his family was from. He was from Ungvar, and that was Nusach Ashkenaz. And maybe later we'll talk a little bit more his connection to Chassidus.
Okay, yeah. So basically, everyone that everyone thinks now, the Hungarians daven Sfard, Nusach Sfard. You think it wasn't like that back then.
Yes,
that's Ashkenaz. Okay, so we'll get back to the connection to the Chassidim now. Something else is that you include in here, and I think you wrote this elsewhere. There's a whole long article that you have in the Sefer in Yad Shleima, which again we'll mention just exactly what the Sefer is later on. But you have a whole article long here about his shaykhus with the establishment of a printing press. He was very involved with the printing press in Ungvar. Very interesting piece. You talk a little bit about his shaykhus there with the press.
Okay, so there's was a Rav in Williamsburg. His name was Israel. I don't remember his first name, but he wrote a Toldus of Rabbi Yosef Chaim Gottlieb. Rabbi Yosef Chaim Gottlieb was the Rav in Stropkov, and he wrote a sefer. I think it was Tiv Gittin, and in the back of the sefer is printed in Ungvar. In the back of the sefer, there are chidushim from Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. And Rabbi Israel was the Rav. I think it was Bunny had the Rav. So he, in his biography, he writes, I don't know why there's chidushim of Rabbi Shlomo Ganzfried in the back of his sefer. As far as I know, there was no connection between Rabbi Yosef Chaim Gottlieb of Stropkov and Rabbi Shlomo Ganzfried. They had no connection. They were not related in any way. They were not. So why would his chidushim be in the back of his sefer? And he doesn't know what that is. Since I always had an interest in Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, I would look out and I noticed that it wasn't the only sefer printed in Ungvar that had chedushim from Rav Shlomo Ganzfried printed in the back. There's a sefer that's quite a number of Seforim that printed in Ungvar which have his chedushim in the back. And there's a sefer on Mikvoyes. It's called Chedushei Harazah. There's a sefer Divrei Ga'onim from Chaim Aryeh, the Adayin and Sigit. And I was wondering, why would they all have Chedushim of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried printed in the back? It seemed like a little bit interesting. I started searching Seforim printed in Ungvar. And I noticed an interesting thing. He was a dayan there, so it's understandable that those that printed Seforim and Ungvar would be asking him for a haskama. It's normal if you're printing a sefer someplace, you get a haskama from the rabbanim or the dayanim of the city. And what I found was that even though his haskama was there, it was never referred to as a haskama. It was always said like Divrei Harav Shlomo Ganzfried. There was no titles either. It never said Harav Hagoyin. So it would say Haskamas Hagoyin. For example, in the Sefer of Parei Chag, and you have Haskamas Harav Hagoyin of Ram Yitzchak Weinberg, and the Av Bezin of Kleinvadan, and then the Haskamas Harav Hagoyin Hamafursam Chaim Simanheimer, the Av Bezin of Ungvar, and right next to them, let's say, it's printed in the same font, the same way as Michte Me'arav, Hamor HaGodlam, a person without writing Hagoyin, Merein Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. Or in the Askama on the Sefer Divrei Gaonim, you have the Askama of, Moshe Shik from Brezheva and from Reb Shmelkel Salish, and underneath it's Divrei Harav Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. So I was wondering about that. Why is it that he's never titled Askamas? And then I noticed that there was Seforim where the Chasam Sofer was printed in Ungvar, and in the front also again his Askam is called a Kol Koira. It says a Kol Koira from Shlomo Ganzfried. But he writes that the Kisvei Kodesh of this work, before they were printed, they were in my house, and all the galleys that were printed, I had seen them. I was wondering, what is that about? And the more I looked, I found that he was actually involved in printing in the printing press in Ungvar. There's a Sefer L'Shein Tzadik, and which is a Toldus of Reb Shlomo Kluger, printed by his son. And he also mentions Reb Shlomo Ganzfried. He says that through him, this was printed. And he took upon himself to edit the entire Sefer. And then I found on a number of other Seforim where it's mentioned either at the end of the Mechaber thanks him for editing the Sefer and so on. And actually there's an ad that was put into the paper. The original printing press in Ungvar was a non-Jewish printer. His name was Karl Jaeger. After he died, it was his widow, the widow of Karl Jaeger, and then you have the children, of Karl Jaeger. They stopped printing, and then another printing press by somebody, Max Palachik, they started another printing press. And over there, there's an ad was put into the papers, I think it's in Hamagid, and we're advertising. Okay, so the ad is actually in the Sheves Achim publication, and there's an ad which says that there's somebody by the name of Max Palachik. He's advertising that he's opening a printing press, and he writes clearly that the editing will be under the supervision of Rav HaGoyim HaFursim, Reb Shlomo Ganzfried, and we'll print whatever we can. That printing press actually didn't last long. They printed maybe one or two Seforim, and the last Sefer printed in Ungvar, maybe we'll talk about it later when we talk about Reb Shlomo Ganzfried Seforim, was Ahalei Shem, Reb Shlomo Ganzfried Sefer on Gittin, and at that time, apparently he became ill, and that was the last Sefer, and I think that might have been connected, because he was really actively involved in the printing of all the Seforim that were printed in Ungvar, and once he became ill, the printing stopped.
So this is interesting. So nobody knew this before you came across this. I had nobody. People must know, but whenever you do it wasn't really known.
No, it was not. It was not known.
Now, also to drive home the point, I think you mentioned this earlier. He wasn't the Rav in Ungvar; he was a dayan. So was this like a supplement to his income, or he was just interested in this? Why? Did he know why he was doing this?
I didn't mention, but the first Sefer printed in Ungvar, which is also something that I talk about in the Yad Shlomo, was probably the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. It was the Shals Chuvas Maram Ash. The second volume was also printed in Ungvar and Tafresh Chof Dalid, and there's an article about the prints in Ungvar, and he mentions it as the first print. But I think Shlomo Ganzfried Sefer was actually printed by the dates of the Haskama. I think I'm able to prove that the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch was the first Sefer printed in Ungvar. So he might have started the print to print his own Sefer and the Sefer of the Maram Ash, who had been the Rav in Ungvar. And probably it was a way of supplementing his income. We know he had other things that he probably did to supplement his income. He had Bachram sleeping in his house. So it is probably as a dayan, it wasn't the income wasn't enough. So whatever he could do, he probably did.
Interesting. So his own Seforim, not only he wrote, we'll talk more about his Seforim soon, but his own Seforim. So not only did he write them, he was actually editing his Seforim.
He was editing his Seforim. There's also a correspondence between him and in the Kesses HaSofer, the second edition, where he has at the end he goes through the Messiah, the different molay and chaser he has a list of all the mollays and chaser in Chumash. So there's a correspondence between him and a well-known sefer, and you see clearly he keeps on editing back and forth, and he writes where he's up to in the writing. He's done so far. He's each Gillian. I don't know. He said each Gillian as it's being published. He writes, I'm done with that. Any corrections, send them to me. So it's clear that he was involved. And at one of the auctions recently sold one of his Seforim, I don't recall which, and it looks like it was from the press. There's pieces, it's in the process of being edited, and one of his Seforim being re-edited to be reprinted.
Inky Fingers, I think we had a podcast recently on your show.
Yes.
We talked about the expression, I think, from the printing press. Okay.
Yes.
So very, 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 very interesting that he was involved. And this article is like 40 pages that you published this article elsewhere, now you include it in the Yad Shlomo.
Yes.
This is one of the parts of the Yad Shlomo. So you can, okay, interesting. Now we'll get to the other parts. I guess we should mention here already before I want to get to the chasidim, but the Yad Shlomo is, you can talk about, I know it's like a middle, but we should mention it already. We've alluded to this. It's kind of not a full-fledged biography of him. There's 7 parts. In the beginning, there is a biography, but not from you. You included 2 biographies of grandchildren. You want to mention the biography?
Okay, so it's really material about and by Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. That's what the Yad Shlomo is, and it's a collection that sort of just developed on its own. I had written this article about Rav Shlomo Ganzfried and the printing press. I had written an article about Rav Shlomo Ganzfried and chasidim. I had also, which I had published earlier, I had written an article about the family of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, which I hadn't published. And I collected, there's 2 biographies by Rav Shlomo Ganzfried's grandchildren. One by Reb Chaim Brody, who was a Rav in Prague. He was a more Zionistic, he's famous, he was on Piyut, he put out a lot of works on Piyut. So he wrote, as a young, when he was still learning in Preshburg, he wrote a biography of his grandfather. It's printed in one of the in Yitzchak Stroh. So it was printed in Yitzchak Stroh in Tafresh Mem Tes. That would be, just a number of years after his grandfather passed away. His other grandson, Rabbi Cheskel Barnett, who was a Rav in Varal, Senior Varal, he wrote, after his grandfather passed away, a number of years later, he printed the Sefer Shem Shlomo with Chedushim of his grandfather that he had from Kisvi Yodos. And in the beginning, he printed a Toldus, which has been reprinted many times, although it's been played around with, pieces taken apart, added or taken away. So I reprinted those 2 Toldus. I also reprinted a Toldus from Yehuda Rubinstein. So there's 3 biographies of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, short biographies of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. I also collected letters, haskamis, and that type of material from Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, which, on different places. Some of it was never published before.
Then there's the part about the press and also the Chassidus.
Those articles, the article about the press, about Chassidus, and also Haskamis to Rav Shlomo Ganzfried's Seforim, where you get an idea of the way people write about him and, those that knew him, and has a lot of information about Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. And then at the end, I included a bibliography of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried's Seforim and especially the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, the different editions until about the time of the Second World War, till 1940 and 1945.
Right, and that bibliography is around 100 pages, so that's longer. Now, one thing they did forget to mention one thing, that you also include a very small kuntris of his, that's why I say for Hagoloi, right, against reform.
Okay, so there is his grandson mentions that he wrote a Michtav Goloi, a Sefer Goloi against reform. Now, there's also a biography in the Pnei Shloimos, the Pnei Shlomo, there's a biography in the beginning where they mention all this Seforim, but they're not aware of this Sefer. And my uncle who wrote a book on Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, he originally, I remember him telling me that there is no such a Sefer. It's just probably a manuscript or something. It's probably not a real thing, even though the grandson mentions that it was written in Jacob Katz, in his Kesses HaSofer, there is a photocopy of the title page of this Kuntris, the German title page of the Kuntris. And but he probably did not see it or did not use it, because he doesn't mention it any place in this whole discussion of the Teilung, in Hungary, the rift between Orthodoxy and the Neologen, which was the Hungarian reform, and Jacob Katz doesn't mention it in his book. So I probably didn't see it. My uncle, who was then researching Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, he called up the publisher to find out where it came from, and it came from Meir Chayviv, had a copy of it. And my uncle got a copy, and he sent me a copy. At that time, he told me he doesn't want it printed, they don't want to print it, but I printed it here. I only printed the Hebrew part. I didn't print the German, so I feel that's okay. And it's also many, many years ago, so I hope that's fine. Also, I think the Sefer was again on sale, was once on sale on auction. So I figure it's got to be someplace. And today, somebody could probably find another copy in a library. But I had a copy. It's interesting. The history of is of the split in Hungary, and the famous Congress which was in Pest in 1869. It goes back to they were in 1848 at the time of they rebelled against the Austrian government. There was the rebellion, and there were many Jews that were involved, and the Austrian government, they put a fine on the Jewish community, a tremendous fine. Later, they agreed that the fine would be used to create schools for the Jews, or whatever it was, a shul fund. And the question was exactly what to do with the money. And that's what the Congress was about, if I understand correctly. And the Maskilim, or the Neologues, the reformers, they wanted to make a seminary, and the rabbanim were against it. And this was, and at that time is when the chasidim, the Orthodox rabbanim, walked out of the Congress, and they split. And from that was the famous split in Hungary between the Neologues and the Orthodox. And then you had those that Brazil Hildesheimer in the middle, that they stayed in the middle. So his grandson writes, which is interesting, he writes that his grandfather, Shlomo Ganzfried, was the first one that called for separation, which I don't know if that's recorded anywhere else, or if that's known. But over here, he has a little booklet, which he printed then, and it's addressed to the Neologen. And if you read it, it's actually extremely polite, very, very civil. He says, Elachenu Congress, the ones that are looking, the deputirtin hamavakshim lasis chadosher sparatseinu. So it's a letter to them, and he explains that we can't live together. It's just not going to work. He says there's nothing like a religious war. We can't go together. So he says, it pains me. That's the way he finishes. He finishes, if so, my brothers, even though it's very difficult. Kosha aleinu pridaschem. It's difficult to separate, but nevertheless, this is what you want. Why do we need to make all these problems, to waste time over here in Pest? There's no point. We're wasting money. We're just fighting around. Let us not fight. We are brothers. But just separate from us. Go before we have some major war. And actually, that's what took place. I don't know if it was as simple as that. But so it's a very interesting document. And it's the first time that it's been printed since 1869.
Right, in the new edition, it's 7 pages, very small. So you mentioned you only printed the Hebrew. So, and there was a German also. You have in the Sefer, you have pictures of both Sharblat. Did he write it in? Did he write German? Was someone translate it for him?
My assumption is that he wrote it in German. In Bani Had, when he was in yeshiva, there was a school, and my assumption is that he did learn German. There was other rabbanim who learned. I think one of the Goiteins, remember if it was Hersh Goitein, was also in yeshiva, probably at the same time, and I think he did learn German. And it's a pretty faithful translation of the Hebrew. It's almost exactly the same, and I think it is. It doesn't say it's been translated, and I would assume that it's his. I also have a feeling that he might have written other letters to the papers in German, but that's just, I haven't verified that.
So the other article, I guess, that you wrote, that you included here, is his shaykhus to chassidus. We mentioned this earlier, his connection to his friend, and so talk about that now. What was his connection to chasidim?
So, like we mentioned, Rav Shlomo Ganzfried traveled together with Reb Hershel Liske as a child. When Reb Hershel Liske was a child, they traveled together to Bani Hado. They learned together by Reb Hershela, and they were there for many years together until they each went back home and got married. And they kept close throughout all the years. They kept very close. In his Sefer Apriyon ala Torah, one of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried's Sefer is a Sefer on Drush, Apriyon ala Torah. He mentions more than one word in the name of the Yismach Moshe, and he writes, in one place he writes that, he writes that I heard Mipeh Kodesh Hagoyin Maram Teitelbaum. So that gives the impression that he actually heard it from the Yismach Moshe himself. And it makes sense because, like we said, on the way traveling, originally when he traveled from Ungvar to Bani Ad, he would have passed through Il, and that's probably where they picked up Hershel Liske as a child, and probably on his way back he would have passed by Il. So he would have seen the Yismach Moshe, and it's possible that he went at other times. There's also other things that he brings down from Chassidish Seforim. He brings one word that he heard in the name of the Chayzer from Lublin, who the Chayzer was a Rebbe of the Yismach Moshe, so it would make sense that he had heard that word through the Yismach Moshe. He brings down from the Kedushas Levi, the Meir Nesivim, the Arvei Nachal, and he brings down some word from Reb Hershel Liske himself. So obviously there was some Chassidish influence on Rav Shlomo Ganzfried.
Now, another thing you write about in here is the Pulmus Man Kriyashma. You talk about the Ben Chasidim LaAshkenazim. What was his shaykh's connection to that?
Okay, so the Kamarna, Isaac Kamarna, it's known he had a shita in Zman Krishma that he paskins like the Shach that shows Shabbos, that every single day Zman Krishma would be always exactly on the clock. In other words, it would be 1/3 of the day on the clock. I guess 9 o'clock daily would be, say, Zman Krishma. And Rav Shlomo Ganzfried had a very hard time with that because nobody really paskins that way, and he felt that it's, he would, in the words of, he should go out la'arech milchama, to declare war and a battle against the Sefer of the Kamarna Rebbe, and he felt it would be a big mitzvah. But before he went ahead, he figured, let me clear it with my Chassidish friend, and he wrote a letter to Reb Hershel Liske telling him what his plans were. And Rabbi Shlomo wrote back a long letter, and he says, I got your letter, and you're asking about whether I should go out to battle against Isaac Hamanus. He says, listen to me. If you listen to me, don't get involved with this, because he's a tzaddik, a Talmid Chacham, a well-known Yerushalayim, and he's a Benan Shal Kedoshim. Though, he's a Baki, Nigla, Nista, and and then he goes into the whole halach. He goes into the halachic aspect of it, and he says that you see that his talmidim and those that are under his influence are Baruch Shem Erlich Yidin, and you don't have what to worry about. So therefore, if you'll listen to me, you won't go into any. And apparently, that's what happened. In other words, he never came out against him. And this article I printed in the Heichal Baal Shem Tov. I printed the article, and somebody responded, and somebody wrote a letter to the Heichal, and he pointed out where in the Kesses HaSofer from Shlomo Ganzfried on the Kesses HaSofer, he talks about the Kamarna, and then he mentions that he brings something from the Kamarna Sefer, and then he says, and when I met him, we discussed it. So obviously, either at a later point that they had known each other somewhat. One other thing in connection with chasidim with Rav Shlomo Ganzfried is that in the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, there's a letter where he writes on what he based the psakim of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and he writes that he based the psakim on three of the Gedolei HaPoskim, on the Chaya Adam and the Derech Chaim and the Sivis, and on the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the Shulchan Aruch of the Baal HaTanya. And also in the Kesses HaSofer, which we'll talk about soon, there's one whole section on the Ksivas HaOisis is actually word for word from Shulchan Aruch Harav. He quotes the Shulchan Aruch Harav. So he obviously had a good connection to Chassidim. In the famous Machlokes Tzan's Rizhin, he wrote a letter in defense of the Divrei Chaim, in defense of Sanzerov, and there's also a long psak from the Bezdin of Ungvar, which parts of it are printed here in the Yad Shleima, where he talks about the Machlokes, and he tries to make shalom between the original Hasidim and the Tzanza Hasidim. So even though it's the psak din is from the Bezdin of Ungvar, but it's in his handwriting, and since he was, in general, he wrote beautifully, so he was the one who would write. So it's his psak.
Okay, so that's in the Yad Shleimo in that article as well. Okay, I think we should talk about this far, and we pushed it off for long enough. So it's funny. Before I was asking you, should I somehow ask what's his most monumental sefer, most important sefer, whatever? But l'maisa, between Kitzur Shulchan Aruch and Kesses HaSofer, the two of them alone, it's impossible to decide which one to decide. To even say they're both such monumental, important, famous Seforim. So Kesses HaSofer is his first sefer. We probably should start there. The Kesses HaSofer, for those who know, on Safras. For those that don't know, you can talk more about it. But just some Sefers Haskama, I will read. He says, "Ani poiket al kol talmidi hamachuyavim l'shmei b'ka." Anyone's mechuyev to listen to me. Shemiyom hatfasa Sefer Kesses HaSofer allows, from the day that this Sefer Kesses HaSofer is printed. Mikan ve'elech, from now on, leyitnu rishus v'ksav kabbalah l'shum Sefer. No rishus and ksav to any Sefer ki'im she'abaki b'Sefer Hazev ragul al l'shoneh. So this is like from like the most strong. I don't know if this is stronger than some Sefer ever gave, but this is the Sefer from now on. So let's start off talking about why he wrote this and about the Sefer.
Okay, so why he wrote the Kesses HaSofer, his grandson, I think Rabbi Kaskon writes that he was in Debrecen, and he was at a stand that was selling Seforim, and he found the Sefer of Yemen Sefer on Safras, I think Kanfa Yona. And when he saw the Sefer, he realized there's a need for a Sefer on Safras, on Hilchas Safras in a simple style. And in general, Shlomo Ganzfried had a beautiful way of writing. His writing is beautiful, and so he decided to write a Sefer on Safras. Apparently, he sent it to the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer was then vacationing in Yergon near Preshburg. From the letter, it doesn't look like he was asking for a haskama. It looks like he was just asking to see if it was okay. Not ready. I don't know if he was ready to print it or not, but the Chassam Sofer writes back that I saw the Sefer, Kesses HaSofer, which you collected, the Dino of Sefer Torah, Tefillin and Mezuzah, and like you mentioned, everything that he writes about it. But what's interesting is he writes, V'avarti ben b'seirav, I went through the entire thing, Mereishal Sefer. So, it was a small Sefer. The Kesses HaSofer today is a lot bigger than it was. Then this is the Madura Kam. It's the first edition of the Kesses HaSofer. And he writes, V'hinech kulach yafer ayasi. It's totally beautiful. Einbach, mechuven la'halach al derech ha'emes. It's mechuven la'halach al derech ha'emes, which, chasidim or whatever would say that he means. It's not only al pi nigla is everything perfect, but it's al derech ha'emes. So it's a tremendous thing. He says, and then he goes on to ask for every that his talmidim should. And since then, the Kesses HaSofer has become a sefer. It was printed the first time in 1835. That's Rav Shlomo Ganzfried's first sefer. And since then, it's been a sefer that's used by Seforim all over. It's the classic sefer on Safras. Years later, in the 1870s, in 1871, he redid it. He added a whole nother section, and that's another sefer. Some people have reprinted just the first edition because they say that's the one that the Chassam Sofer gives us haskama, and that's the one we could definitely rely on.
I wanted to hop in for 1 second. I don't know if you wrote in here or someone else and saying not Chaz Shalom to detract of Shlomo Ganzfried, but this haskama of the Chassam Sofer, it does only apply to that first Madura, because the second Madura, again, not to detract Shalom, but at the end of the day, the Chassam Sofer didn't write the haskama there.
Right. One other interesting thing about this haskama that I mentioned before, it's a haskama from the Chassam Sofer, and since one section of the Kesses HaSofer is from the Shulchan Aruch, it's from the Balatanya, so we have a haskama from the Chassam Sofer on a piece of work of the Balatanya, which is of interest.
Yeah, I think there's some shuvas maybe with some sefer about chasidus. Anyways, whatever. That's not this. The podcast is not about some sefer in chasidus. But right, okay. So that's the Kesses HaSofer. This was his first sefer print, and he said he redid it later on.
Later on, right? Madura Basra.
Okay, so what was? I mean, I know that, like I said, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is other monumental, but I don't know if we want to leave that for a minute and go, well, what did he print next?
Okay, the next sefer he printed was, he reprinted the Siddur Derech Chaim of the Mesivis, the Yaakov Melissa. He reprinted the Siddur. He added on the halachas, he added his Hagaz. They're in brackets in the first edition. They're bracketed, so you have the piece of the Derech Chaim, and then he added certain halachas that were not in the Derech Chaim at all. He added, different sections, different halachas. And that's probably where he first got into halacha, which later became, the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And besides that, there's a pirush that he wrote, a very simple, a beautiful, straight pirush on davening, straight through. It's, very simple, based on Avodram, and it's a very nice pirush. And he writes that he printed the sefer because people were davening and were not really always aware of the of what they were saying in davening, and because of that he printed the next sefer that he published in Taf Reish Vav, 1846. He printed the Pnei Shlomo on Masechtas Baba Basra. It's a classic on anybody who's ever learned Masechtas Baba Basra has used it, and he printed that when he was a Rav in Brezovitz. At that time, he had already moved to Brezovitz. He was a Rav in Brezovitz. He mentions in one place that he was learning with Talmidim in Brezovitz. It's also interesting because he has the dates of when he began the sefer and when he finished. You could see how long it took him to move on with the Masechta. That was printed in 1846, and 2 or 3 years later, it's Taf Reish Tes, it's probably the beginning of the year, in 1848, he printed Torah Zebach on Hilchos Shchita. That's not as famous a sefer, was also actually reprinted a number of times in his lifetime. And I don't know if the sheikhtim are still using it. I did find copies of Torah Zevach amongst Seforim of sheikhtim, older sheikhtim, where they had Torah Zevach. It was reprinted. I don't know if it was reprinted even recently. I'm not sure if there is a modern reprint of it. Okay, that was that. The next sefer was Lechem Simla, Anilchos Nida and Mikvayis, which that's still quite popular. Anybody who's learned Nida Mikvayis, people use it. It was printed in 1861. Let me just mention also on Torah Zevach and on the Lechem Simla, he has a skama from the Divrei Chaim, which is interesting. He's the only person who has actually 3 askamas, because he took another askama later from the Divrei Chaim. He's the only sefer that has, the only mechaber who has 3 askamas from the Divrei Chaim. And the Torah Zevach, which he printed early on Ilchos Shchita in 1848, is one of the first askamas that Divrei Chaim gave. The Divrei Chaim gave many, many, many askamas, but he was one of the first people that went to get askama from the Divrei Chaim. So that's a Lechem Simla. In the back of the Lechem Simla is a description, which is just interesting, of the mikveh that he built in Ungvar. With the pump and where the water comes in, and how it seems like he was some sort of also he was like a hands-on technical type of a person. You see that from there, and also in the Pnei Shlomo on different sugyas, there's some some geometry. He puts in some in the first print. It's very nice, like on a whole page. These different diagrams with this geometry. So he must have learned, other limudim and other things he must have been knowledgeable about too. So the next sefer was printed in 1864, Tafresh Chav Daled. That's the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. That's the famous thing. Maybe we'll talk about that separate. The same year in 1864, and the previous Seforim were printed not in Ungvar. It was Kesses HaSofer printed in Offen, in it's like Budapest. The Derech Chaim was printed in Wien, I think. The Pnei Shlomo was printed in, I think, Zalkova, and the Torah Zevach was, I think, also Zalkova. I'm not sure. The Lechem Simla was printed in Lemberg, and the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch and the Apriyon were both printed the same year, and they were the first Seforim. A number of some were printed that first year of the print of the new printing press in Ungvar.
Now, I almost mentioned already here that the Lechem Simla is a nice new addition. Apriyon is available, but it's still a little, like Rashi letters. No one made like a really modern. It's nice, but it's not like a fancy new edition.
There are a few new ones.
Apriyon?
Yeah, but they're not popular.
They're not as nice. I will mention also Pnei Shlomo. So if anyone had learned about, like I said, there is, and Machon Yerushalayim, like you already mentioned, the 5-volume set. First of all, I don't know why. For some reason, it's seemingly only sold as a set. I don't know why. Pnei Shlomo is the one that he printed. That's the most important. Not sure. And the other ones are just like stuff you have Ksav Yad, Likutim. It's not exactly the same. So I don't know, but again, it's available 5-volume set. There's some other Ksavim there from him. Actually, I think in the biography of the grandson, they mentioned that, I think Nesser mentioned that the Bamatzia, someone stole it. Right, someone stole the Ksav Yad. It was he had a whole set ready to go in Bamatzia. Someone stole it. They never found it.
Right.
Crazy story. But
there are in the 5-volume set, there is on Bamatzia. They do have. So either he wrote again Chidushim or some other Maduris or whatever it might be. Okay, and then the next sefer was the Michtav Galui, which we spoke about, that little pamphlet in 1869, and then he reprinted the Kesses HaSofer with a Madura Basa. It's a lot larger than the original in 1871, and then he took again a skama from the Sons of Rav on that sefer. A few years later, in 1878, he printed that's really sort of his final sefer, the Alei Shem. That's on Hilchos Shemus Gittin, and that was the last sefer that he printed. And after he passed away, his grandson printed Shem Shlomo, which is Chedushi Sugyas. And then later, like you mentioned, there's the Pnei Shlomo that Machon Yerushalayim printed on the other Masechtas from manuscripts and things that they had found.
Are there any other Kisvei Yad still around, or everything? Not like a full Seforim?
Okay, so Mechon Yerushalayim was a Rabbi Buxbaum at one point. After the Soviet Union fell, or I don't know exactly when, people went back to Uzhgorod, and Rav Shlomo Ganzfried's Seforim and Ksavim must have been just laying in the Beis Medrash, because the dealers at that time were selling Seforim with his signature, and you see them on auction from time to time. And I know that they even just cut out the sharblots of the Seforim to sell them. There were so many of his Seforim in the Beis Medrash. So amongst those things, there was also a few boxes of Kisvei Yadus of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, and that's what the Pnei Shlomo that Mechon Yerushalayim gave out were taken from there. Now, they're a little bit problematic, because since he worked as a copyist in a press, so he would also copy other people's Seforim, and I think there are also Kisvei Yadus which were not in his handwriting, which might have been from his grandchildren, and they published it all together. I think they themselves recognize in the introductions that it's not everything is 100% from Shlomo Ganzfried. So it's hard to know what's what. But they also write that they will eventually publish shuvas and also miscellaneous manuscripts, poems. He was pretty poetic, and Dagdama to most of his Seforim, he writes poetry. So they wrote that at one time they will publish that, and I don't think they never did, and I don't know that, I'm not aware that they're planning on. And I think that, I'm hoping that somebody has all the copies of all the Kisvei Yadus, because the dealers have been selling pieces here, there, and everywhere. So I don't know where there is. There's also Rabbi Rubenstein in his biography writes that one of the grandchildren has a whole sefer with the sources to Kitzur Shulchan Aruch that Rav Shlomo Ganzfried wrote. For some reason, I don't think that's really true. I think they might be referring to a letter that was printed later where he writes a little bit, a source for one thing or another, but I don't really think there's an entire chibur, but I don't know.
So let's go to Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Let's talk about Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. His, not that in Kesses HaSofer, but Kitzur Shulchan is probably the most famous work, especially for Hamaynan. That's his most what he's known as. So let's talk about the Sefer, the style, why he wrote it, and how it became this smash hit.
He writes why he wrote it, and it's on every. It should be on every kitzah. It isn't. He wrote it as a sefer for the hamoinam, for your average person who's a Yireh Shamayim. His words are the te'eles hamoin am Hashem, for the te'eles of the hamoinam people, achinu b'nei Yisrael, hayireim es Hashem, who fear Hashem, and asher kotzer dait l'ilmid l'haven divrei Shulchan Aruch mefarishav, who have a difficult time to learn the words in Shulchan Aruch and mefarishim, and he collected all the halachas from all four halachim of Shulchan Aruch and from all other Sifrei Kodesh, dinim that are necessary and mukhrach for every Jew to know them. That's actually more or less the wording of his introduction to the first edition. There's one change in the second edition, and he writes the dinim and the midas. No, it's also a little bit ethical, and which in Kitzur there are Prachim, he talks about midas toivus and hanhagas toivus, and even health hanhagas. That's what the Sefer Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is. I think in a way it might have been a little bit of a response to the neolog. There were many people who are then tradition was who are leaving the traditional way of life. And the main thing, is the thing that always kept Yidden, on the straight and narrow was halacha l'maisa, and he felt that there was a strong need for every simple person to know what it was. And the Sefer obviously, was on target because it took off. It kept on getting republished. What's interesting is at the same time in Ungvar, that same year, there was another sefer printed in Yiddish, also in the same style, Halichas Olam, which he probably was also involved in. It was by a Mechutnefes, by Brody, but that had two printings, and then I don't think it was ever reprinted. It's old style Yiddish today. It definitely wouldn't have any value. That's.
So you mentioned the sources of Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. I mean, do we know what's with the sources?
So again, he writes in a letter that in a letter later, he writes that he based it on these three poskim, the Chaya Adam and the Der Chaim and Shulchan Aruch Harav. There are later Seforim that actually give, piece by piece, different halachas. I think the David Feldman and his kids, I think, does something like that. So that's, if somebody wants to know actually where the Makairis of the different halachas. There's one other interesting thing about Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, which is unique, and it has to do with the many prints of Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. He was constantly editing the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. It came out, I don't know how many times in his lifetime, probably about 20, and it was printed in 1865. He passed away in 1888. So from 1864, he was printed first in 1864, and the last print was 1884, the last print in his life. This is about in 20 years, and it was probably printed about 20 times. It's hard to keep track of the different editions. And he was constantly editing. Until the last edition, he was constantly changing things and editing. So it's a sefer that's really muga. It has a very, very strong editing of the sefer.
Now, were all those that were printed in his lifetime were printed in Ungvar, and then he was involved in editing, or some were printed elsewhere?
The only Kitzur Shulchan Aruch printed in Ungvar was the first edition. The first edition he printed in Ungvar. I would assume that the other Seforim, which they were not so profitable, he printed himself. I think once he realized that Kitzur was profitable, he hired a printer and a distributor in Lemberg, which was a place from where Seforim could be distributed easier. And there was a whole trade of Seforim, a book trade, and that's why he had it printed in Lemberg. And it was printed many times in Lemberg by Zis, rabbanus and Zis. He was Rav Shlomo Ganzfried's printer in Lemberg. And most of the editions were printed there. He had also given permission to printer in Warsaw to print, and then there were many pirated editions printed in Warsaw without his permission, which he was very upset about.
Right. Okay. So Lemberg, Lviv. There was a big fair there, right? I think. It
was a commercial town.
Right. It was a big commercial town. So that's where the Seforim were
printed.
So Kitzur Shulchan Aruch is saying specifically it's not only the Tfus Rishon, because it's been added to so many things that he was Magia. So the later ones. Now, just so you included bibliography in here, like you mentioned earlier. Just curious about it. There are so many editions available till today. Are there any? Not to say one is better over the other, or one out of the other. Any particular one that you use or you recommend to listeners that that have specific? Again, not to say that one's better over the other. I'm not asking you that question. Just
I don't know in terms of today's Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. I don't know. You have all types. You have, there's one that came out recently, a Taimana one. There's one that somebody in Williamsburg gives out, and he made sure to take out any words that sound a little bit of Vritish. He spells a Vrit, Ayin, Vez, ratio, test. He takes out anything from a Vrit. It's in the introduction. And then there are more, there are all types. So everybody, whatever anybody prefers. There's that new art scroll, 5-volume, which I think Rav Shlomo Ganzfried would not have appreciated. He wanted it to be a kitzur, and he would have wanted it in 1 volume. But everything has its place, and for every person is
the Shapsi Frankel edition.
On the art scroll, just one more thing, that they're missing that little introduction. And I'm sure they can always put it in. Those few lines on the Sharblat, which he put on every single edition of his purpose of why he's printing it, art scroll did not translate.
Really?
Put in, yeah. I don't know.
Interesting. So,
but in terms of the original editions, and that art scroll is the last edition is the Tafresh Mem Dalet edition, the edition of 1884, which that's the final edition, and that's what they used as their basis.
Interesting. Okay, so yeah, there are many editions today. I think when I learned Kitzur Shulchan Aruch a number of years ago, I used the Shapsi Franco one, and I liked it because it was small and big. That's mamish the one volume you can take it with you. I'm not saying that one or the other one. I just find them very accessible, very usable. There are many editions of it now.
Yeah, in my bibliography, I only covered up till about the war time. I didn't go further. But there's a lot of interesting things about the different editions. I'll give a small example. There's a shaila in Hilchis Tzedakah when a person has to give ma'aseh from his money. So in the Kitzur, he says that that's after he subtracted, after he took off his personal expenses, and the mice is taken after that. So there's one of the rabbanim here in Lakewood, Rav Shmuel Felder, he mentions it, and he says that in the early editions of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, this halach is not found. So therefore, he thinks that perhaps it was just an addition by the, because it's only in the last edition. He says maybe it was inserted by the printer or by the not by Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. So it's interesting because in the edition before, in the 1881 edition of Kitzur, there are like 4 pages, a little contrast in the back, which also I don't think anybody had ever picked up on. And he writes that by the time I got to send the corrections, the first, I don't know how many prakim were already printed. So therefore I'm sending the corrections separately. And this is one of the corrections where he adds this, so it's directly straight from Shlomo Ganzfried. There's no question, that can't be changed.
Wow. Okay, so that you include, like you said, a bibliography here, and you have the pictures of a lot of the Sharmlat. Over here, you talk about some other nispachim. So there's a lot in the Sefer about Kitzur Shulchan Aruch.
Okay, so the different editions of the Kitzur, most of them are, printed in Lemberg by rabbanus and Ziz. It's hard to know the exact numbers. Many of them say this is print number so-and-so, print number so-and-so, print number 10, print number 11. The last print of rabbanus and Ziz writes, this is the 14th print that I'm printing for Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. So if he doesn't include the one that was printed by Rav Shlomo Ganzfried himself and the few that were printed in Warsaw, so that would probably put it about 20. And it's sort of hard to know exactly, which editions are. I tried to put in the ones that I had actually seen, but still I didn't see all of them. So I don't know an exact count, but probably about 20 were printed b'chayir b'Shlomo Ganzfried, and then they kept on being printed. Now, connection to the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, there's a sefer Kesses HaSofer. The Kesses HaSofer, he was impressed with the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and he wrote to many ha'aris and additions to the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. He wrote to Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, and Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, he wrote to Rav Shlomo Ganzfried that he would love to publish his sefer Kesses HaSofer as together with the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And Rav Shlomo Ganzfried responded that he really wanted, he gave him haskama. He says, you have my haskama to print the sefer. However, he says, I looked at the contrasting that you sent me, and I see that you're a big Talmid Chacham, but this that you're planning to print them together with the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, I don't really like it for a number of reasons. But if you'd like to print it extra as a separate chibur, you have my blessings. And I will buy one too, etc. So that's what the Kesses HaSofer did. He printed a small contrast. It's a very small contrast. It's called Kesses HaSofer. It's printed in 1877. And as soon as Rav Shlomo Ganzfried was nifta, a year later, He was nifted in 1886. Like a year or two later, the Kesses HaSofer came out on the side of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, together with the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, with the Haskama of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, but obviously missing 2-3 lines where he, mentions that he, and then in the Haskamas that he got to his Sefer, he, got different rabbanim that explained why a mechaber of a Sefer really has no bailus on his Sefer, and so therefore he really doesn't have a right not to allow you to print it together with the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And what's ironic is that the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch was then printed many times together with the Kesses HaSofer. After the war in the 1950s, Eshkol printed the Kesses HaSofer, and they bought the rights from the grandchildren of the Kesses HaSofer to print the Sefer, which has the Haskamas, which explain that nobody owns their Sefer and they can't, and he claims full copyright, even though the Sefer is a Sefer that it says inside can't be copyrighted. But that's, I guess, the way things go. One other interesting thing, there's a number of interesting things in the bibliography on the different Kitzur Shulchan Aruchs. There's a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch that came out in Vilna in 1901, with 2 pirushim. By the way, you see that by that time it moved to Lita, and it was printed in Vilna So the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch came out with a pirush called Amudei HaShulchan by Rabbi Yeshaya Kohen ben Rabbi Yeshua official from Bialystok, who his last name was Paskevich, and he was a Rav in the Chayei Medrash in Bialystok for many years, for over 40 years. And then there's another part which is called Kesses HaSofer. There's 2 pirushim on this Kitzur Shulchan Aruch with many chidushim, and it has askama from actually a Chassidish Rebbe from the Trisk, Rabbi Yaakov from Trisk, and apparently there's some sort of a competition between this Kitzur Shulchan Aruch printed in Vilna and the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch printed in Lublin by the Kesses HaSofer. In the back they have a Haidah that theirs is better, and this goes back and forth. So that's this Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And there's one interesting thing. If you look at all the prints of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch that I have listed, they're printed in places like Vilna, Lemberg, places where they're meant for distribution. Later in Wien or in Budapest and New York, those are the places that they were meant to be marketed. In Varsha, there's one print in Bialystok, and I just happened to read an interesting article by Yitzchak Stroh, who's an expert bibliographer, and he writes something interesting about Bialystok. He writes that Bialystok was a city that the Seforim printed in Bialystok were printed for use by the people of Bialystok, different than most other prints that were printed for distribution. He says almost all Seforim printed in Bialystok were printed for the people in Bialystok. So I find it interesting because there was in Lita, it was very popular shuls called Chevra Chayei Adam. Now the shuls had shiurim and Chayei Adam, and here we have a Rav from Bialystok who was the Rav in the Chayei Adam shul in Bialystok for 40 years, which obviously he was giving shiurim and Chayei Adam, and then he goes and he writes a pirush on the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch with additional halachas and things on the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And then we find like one random Kitzur Shulchan Aruch printed in Bialystok. So it's possible that at one point it was printed while he was still, there in the Chaya Adam Shul. So it's possible that at one point they switched from Chaya Adam, or in addition to Chaya Adam, they was learning Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. And now it's only an assumption, but I think it might be of interest. But what's of interest of these Seforim is that a number of years later, I'd say maybe 30 years later, in Bilgrai, this is in 1932, in Lodz. There was a sefer printed in Lodz, and it's a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch with a Pirush Aruch HaShulchan Avnei Nezer, and it's anonymous. It's an anonymous Pirush, and it's also written with two Pirushim on the bottom. This Aruch HaShulchan and this Avnei Nezer. He brings down from one of his rebbeim, so you know who he was a Talmud of. He was a Talmud of the Rav in Bilgrai. Now, the interesting thing is that it's just plagiarized straight from the Amudei Shulchan and from the I forget what his name was. No, he had the other one. Yeah, the Kesses HaSofer, whatever it was called. Yeah, he's not the Kesses HaSofer. It's from that Amudei Shulchan. It's straight, and not only that, it's like two pirushim, like on the one on the side of the other, like you have Mishnah Brura and Bir Halacha, like one references the others. He references the other one. He references this one is called Aruch HaShulchan and Avnei Nezer, and he references the Amudei Shulchan by mistake. He forgot to take out the other one they references. So that came down in Bilgrai without, with the anonymous Talmud Chacham, and he has some nice askamas about that gave nice askamas to that they know him as a tremendous Talmud Chacham. And then a little bit later came out another one of these kitzes in Bilgrai, which is also a plagiarism of another one. I don't know who was there and what they were doing, but that's also.
I guess it was a bestseller, made a lot of money.
Yeah, no, and also that sefer, like he calls it Aruch HaShulchan Avnei Nezer. On the Sharblat, he writes that it has pieces from the Mishnah Brura and with the Kesses HaSofer.
He's taking all the famous names.
Yeah, he puts it on the thing, and then it's around. There's a reprint. There's a reprint, and then there's the translations, and that's a whole another subject. I think maybe we'll just leave it.
Yeah, so there's a lot there in your bibliography, as you just said. There's a lot of really fascinating tidbits. I mean, some of these are really interesting. And you do include you talk a little bit about the translations as well, right?
Yeah. The translations up till the war. And then you can write a whole other book on the editions, the later editions.
Right, so that's really, a lot of this is what's included in this Yad Shleim, which is really a fascinating sefer that you put together. So how did you decide what you were going to include here, and are there things that you left out? Before we get to if there's anything you did since you published this, I think you published this, a year or 2 years ago.
Yeah. I left out quite a bit. There's the famous machlokes later with the Adarov, an extreme political on the Divrei Chaim's Shemus Gittin, and then we're in Olei Shem, he argues on the Divrei Chaim, and then there was a sefer put out against Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. Actually, that's the last thing that Rav Shlomo Ganzfried wrote, is the Michsel Oil, which is a response to the Adarov Sefer, although probably he wasn't totally, he wasn't well at the end of his life, and it's reflected in the, in it's just one letter, but he's, it's not written in his style at all, and that's a whole long story. Then there's also, I had a collection of anecdotes, different things people tell about Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, people who met him, or different things, and then from his Seforim itself, I have a collection of different things. He asked why I put what I put in. It's sort of, I was always collecting information about Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, and I'd like to give out something for my son's chasana, so that's what I did. And whatever work I was able to put together, either was already done fully, I put together, and whatever was left out was left out.
Are you writing still more articles on the things about the Shlomo Ganzfried?
I'd love to. Again.
And some of this other stuff you said you left out. Would you put another edition of the Ashlim and include it in there?
I don't know. I really don't know.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I mean, and so on. But one last thing about Rav Shlomo Ganzfried: have there been any other biographies written about him besides for what's really included in here, or not?
So my uncle wrote in English. It's a very nice biography. It's I think the Kitzur in his life by Jackie Friedman. Aronson, I think, published it. You don't know if it's still available. It's and then in the beginning of the Pnei Shlomo, the Mechon Yerushalayim has actually a pretty nice biography of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. One more thing I'd like to mention, where I mentioned Hebrew University has a manuscript of a Bezdin book of his, which is very interesting. It's psukim, that just in Torahs, but it's a fascinating thing. It's about cows and this and that, like that, all these kind of business deals with people, small things, shorter things, Yerushas. It's a very interesting, and it's from the Bezdin, but since he was, the head of the Bezdin, and he was a writer, so almost everything, a lot of it is in his own handwriting or his own things. It's interesting.
Was that ever printed or no?
No, and I maybe printed one piece here, but I had gotten it after, I found it afterwards.
Maybe you should print that next.
I don't know who has the rights to it. I don't know, what that is.
Okay, very good. So I'll post a link in the show's notes. Anyone interested in purchasing this? I know Israel Mizrahi sells. There's a link. I'll link to his website, and brand new. Of course, I know you have to say that sometimes because Israel, a good friend, but he has people still use Seforim, but he has a lot of new stuff as well. So it is brand new. You can get it there. Is there anywhere else that you can get it, or
you can get it through me if you. You can get it directly from me.
I can put your the email address as well, and people can reach out to you. Well, like I said, I'll put Israel's link, and you can get it from Mizrahi as well. Okay, and thank you very much for coming on to talk about the Shlomo Ganzfried.
You're welcome. Thank you.
So this is an addendum with Rabbi Yitzchak Stroh once again. Since we recorded the episode, there have been a number of new publications, new editions of the Seforim of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. So for the sake of accuracy, and once we're doing this podcast, I think it made sense to add on a little bit of a discussion about them. So, let's talk about first the new Pnei Shlomo. New Pnei Shlomo, as we mentioned in the podcast, the Mechon Yerushalayim had a 5-volume. It was green. It was 5 volumes. Now it's shrunk. It's a little smaller. It's cheaper, and it's kind of a purple cover, and it's in 3 volumes.
Yeah. So the Pnei Shlomo, I think we mentioned already, was the only sefer of chidushim al Shas that was printed by Rav Shlomo Ganzfried himself in his lifetime. It was printed in 1845 in his Alkava. And then it's been printed many times. I think it's become a classic and is quoted by later Achronim. Starting in Tashmem Tes, Mechon Yerushalayim began printing from unpublished manuscripts and from Likutim, and also taken from Rav Shlomo Ganzfried's other works. And they published 2 of a number of volumes of Pnei Shlomo. And the first volume, I think we mentioned already, contains a biography of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. And then during the following years, they published additional volumes, including a volume in Tafshin and Tes, Baba Basra, which was, even though it was printed originally by the Mechaber, they reprinted it, and they added additional material from manuscript and other sources. Now, in introduction to the first volume, printed by Mechon Yerushalayim, they write, and I'm going to translate to English, they write like this, that we note and stress here that since some of the notebooks are not in the author's own handwriting, but are copies done by his students, sons and grandsons, and at times they added comments to their own and of their own and of their rebbeim. We tried to note this, but we were not always successful. Shkis miyavmin istars nakeni. And then they write like this: in one of the following volumes of the Pnei Shlomo on Shas, there will appear a detailed list and description of all the manuscripts. In that introduction, Rabbi Buchsbaum also mentions tshuvas, poems, letters, and other writings of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried, which he says after a proper inspection of the material will be published. Now, even though Mechon Yerushalayim definitely deserves a tremendous amount of credit for all the work, that's done the wonderful work, and especially in printing the volumes of Pnei Shlomo, but it seems like recently, when they republished the entire series in 3 volumes, it's everything exactly the way it was, with the same introductions, and really almost nothing added. They added at the end a few reprints of some tshuvas that were actually published. Most of them were published in other kaitzim, and it's really very, very little new material in these 3 volumes. And unfortunately, they never included the poems, the letters, or the additional material that they spoke about. I know that recently some chidushim of Rav Shlomo Ganzfried were offered for sale in the antique market. I don't know if that comes from that original collection, but I know there are still many chidushim out there that unfortunately were never published. And then there's one other issue that I have with the Pnei Shlomo, because even though the Pnei Shlomo, the Shlomo Ganzfried himself wrote on other Masechtas, but he never, made them ready for print. And the only chelik that was made ready by him for print, which means that he edited it, and we know that he was always busy re-editing his work. So when he printed it, I'm sure he worked through it very well. And that's only on Masechtas Baba Basra. And today they reprinted it now in this new edition with the 3 volumes. They put Baba Basra together with some other Masechtas. And they added pieces from Ksav Yad, which, like they themselves say, we don't know 100% what is and what isn't, even though they note that this piece is from Ksav Yad. And then they added other pieces which from different Seforim, which might be a different style than the style that he used when he was writing on, Chedushim, on Gemara Shitaisis, which is different than the Durshan Halacha. And putting it together, especially with the Pnei Shlomo on other Masechtas, which are definitely not edited well, I think is a little bit of a chassan. Because the Pnei Shlomo Baba Basra stands, on its own and should have been reprinted on its own. That's as far as the Pnei Shlomo is concerned.
Yeah, I would add that I think we said on the original recording here that even on when it used to be 5 volumes, it was a shame for a while they were not, as far as I know, they were not selling it single, and that really is kind of a classic work of Masechta Baba Basra. It's almost like Rav Shlomo Ganzfried's I don't know if it makes, but like his magnum opus on Shas. That's like his Sefer on Shas. It's like you said, he printed it. It's a classic, and they redid it, very nice. And it wasn't available only in the set. A lot of other things that were, the little pieces here and there, not that important, but it's just not the same chashivas. And unfortunately, it was together. And now, like you're saying, they mamish put it together in 3 volumes. So now, not only you for sure can't get it separate because it's together with something else. And Stam, Lunabo Basra used to be whatever. It's just together with other things. It's different. They put it together. Notwithstanding, it's. I will say that, like you said, they did do a nice job on the Pnei Shlomo on Shas. It's now 3 volumes. It's shorter. It's much cheaper. So I think it's like $69 now. It's just quite affordable. So on the flip side, the flip side is that it's nice and it's affordable and people can purchase it. Now the next sefer I want to go to is Apriyon. We spoke a little bit about Apriyon, the sefer Al Torah Rav Shlomo Ganzfried. That's been redone now in a nice new font, some notes. Marmakim is a nice new sefer, and I think also it has, I think in the back it has also on Pirkei Avos from the Siddur. If you want to talk about that, and there's a Hakdama, a little bit of a bio, which I think comes from your things, but we again from the Yad Shlema. So, and I want to mention the new Apriyon that came out.
Okay, so it's actually a beautiful print, a really, really nice print, printed by I don't know, Moshe Glick. I don't know who he is, but he's also a descendant of the Mechaber, and it was printed in Yerushalayim, Tafshin Pei Gimel. There are notes, on the Pnei Shlomo. I wouldn't say there was an extensive amount of work put into the notes, but he quotes other Mefarshim or where the Pnei Shlomo will quote a Gemara, he'll give you the Gemara, and add some other different pieces from Medrashim, or from other Seforim that talk about the things in Pnei Shlomo. Another tremendous thing in the new edition is the Mafteach, which there never was a decent Mafteach, and it's Mafteach on Shas, different Seforim, and that makes it very, very helpful to find something if you're looking for a shot in a Gemara or on a pasuk anyplace else. That was very helpful. And then also, like you just mentioned, there's the Pirush on Pirkei Avos that was added to the end. In the beginning, he does a short biography of Shlomo Ganzfried, and I'm happy that he used the Yad Shlomo. And I would just like to comment that he unfortunately did not make use of the bibliography. I guess most people are not into bibliography. And the Yad Shlomo, I put in a bibliography of all the different editions. And I'm just going to point out one footnote where he writes that, I don't know where he writes that in Hamavasa, there's a renowned bibliographer who states that of all the editions of the Kitzur, some copies remain somewhere in some library. But he says the two editions that were printed without the author's permission, he says he didn't find any copies in all the large libraries in the world. He didn't find even a single copy. And he says that we could definitely say the Tzon Yirei of Yasser, that Rav Shlomo Ganzfried is upset with those editions, and therefore they don't exist. But if he would have checked my bibliography, then he would have definitely realized that even though I'm not questioning that with Tzon Yirei of Yasser, but those prints also exist today. They still exist. There are copies of them around. And also, the amount of times the Kitzur was reprinted is, there's constantly the repeating of that it was reprinted 13 or 14 times, and I understand what that's based on. But according to my research, I think it's been reprinted many more times than that. That's that I get for the about the new Apriyon.
Right, and like you said, listen, these are light critiques because you're the expert in Shlomo Ganzfried, so you see you going through it. But I agreed. I think it's a nice page cover. It's a very nice.
It's a really nice work, and it's nice. It's
wonderful. It's a slight critique in the movie. I want to make that clear. This is really, since we recorded. I mean, I want to make sure I emphasize it's really a game changer because the older Apriyon was a blue cover. It was like a Rashi font. There's nothing wrong with it, but it wasn't like a pleasure to learn. You open it up, it's a beautiful font. Like I said, there's some light notes. There's a beautiful mafteach. It's really an amazing index where he goes through, Tanakh and Midrashim and Gemara, and then also there's a mafteach based on Inyanim. So it's really very usable. They added the Pirkei Avos from the Siddur. So it's a very, very, very nice sefer. I think it's around $20-something. Don't quote me that prices fluctuate up and down, but it's pretty accessible.
No question.
Yeah, so that's a really good thing that came out. And the other thing, I don't know if we mentioned it the first time, so we should mention it here. There was a new Kesses HaSofer that came out with some new material, footnotes, that type of thing. So I think you wanted to mention it here.
Yeah, it's Menachem Mendel Kahn, and he put out a Kesses with Piskei Shulchan Aruch and also Psukim of the Tzemach Tzedek, Lubavitch Tzemach Tzedek. And it's really a thorough work. It has notes on the entire Sefer, and it puts all those places where Rav Shlomo Ganzfried disagrees or differs slightly from the Tzemach Tzedek or the Shulchan Aruch. And he explains the sheet really clearly, goes through very clearly, succinctly, everything that's going on. He's mafalpal a little bit, not overdone, really nice, goes through the different achronim. And he's medayik in the lashonis of the Kitzur and in the Shulchan Aruch, to different differences that might not have been noticed at first glance. And, then in the back, the simonim on Hilchos Safras of the Shulchan Aruch are included. And also the psukim of the Tzemach Tzedek are printed separately in the back of the Sefer. I think it's a must for any Chabad Sefer, and for any Sefer or anybody, any Talmud Chacham, it's definitely an important Sefer, and it's a very chashuv thing.
Okay, now, anything else you want to add? Any other new publications or just new information about Rav Shlomo Ganzfried that came out since we recorded the original recording?
Okay, so I was told, I didn't see it, that somebody reprinted parts of the Siddur. The Siddur of Shlomo Ganzfried hasn't been reprinted in really many years. And somebody told me that somebody retypeset and reprinted the Tefillas for Shabbos. So I didn't see it. I don't know what it is. He told me he had seen it in a Swarm store in Williamsburg. And then also I saw somebody reprinted soft cover. Beagle Eisen had it before Pesach. The Haggadah from the Siddur. In the Siddur of the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, he also had a Pirush on the Haggadah. So somebody reprinted the Pirush on the Haggadah, added the pieces from Apriyon on the Haggadah, and the halachas from Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. It's nice. It was fine. I think he told me, I spoke to him, and he told me that it was only preliminary, and maybe next year he'd like to rework it, hardcover, and work on it. So that's those two things. And also, I just don't remember if we talked about it. I don't know. It doesn't really come in here, but somebody had mentioned to me after our interview that the Mishnah Brewer brings down the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch on more than one occasion, aside from the Sefer Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, and also in the Kesses. That was something that I was actually not aware of.
Okay, and you mentioned the Siddur, that's the Avodas Yisrael Derech Chaim. I'm not sure how much we discussed. We're here on a recording. We recorded a few months ago, and we're like trying to remember. I don't remember how much we spoke about the Siddur on the original episode. The listeners have gotten to this point; they'll know if we talked about it. But we sat here recording. I'm not sure if we did. But as you said, it hasn't been out in a while, so you heard someone maybe reprinted part of it. Okay,
okay.
Yeah. So thank you again, Rav Stroh, for joining me. And
thank you. Thank you very much.
And we should add, I'm going to put this in the intro, but this episode is coming out on Rav Shlomo Ganzfried's yard site, so pretty appropriate.
Right, and the correct yard site, which is Chav Ches. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.